So, while I hope this is audible, welcome, I'd say. Welcome to the ISOC briefing panel. Today we're going to talk about identity as a building block. ISOC organizes these events to organize its own work. It's technical work that relates to the technical evolution of the internet, relates to the IETF, and relates to our own work, and all these terms in the most broadest sense of the word. But you are here at an ISOC event, you are not here at the IETF. If work flows out of this, you need to take that elsewhere, you need to take that out of this room. We're not here to do protocol design. So today about identity as a building block, and I forgot to say who I am. My name is Olaf Kolkman. I'm head of the Internet Technology Office at ISOC. And today we're going to talk about identity as a building block. Well, why? These identities and the attributes that relate to identities are somewhat key to establishing trust in the internet. When we perform any sort of communication on the internet, identities are used for that. They're used for authentications, or their associated attributes are used for authentication. And authentication is, for instance, at the base of non-opportunistic encryption. Knowing who or what is on the other side of that line sometimes is very important. So while talking in this panel, while preparing for this panel, we thought about what are those identities? What are the things that we actually want to talk about? We want to talk about identities as they relate to subjects. And those subjects can be personae, but they can also be the things that belong to persona. We can talk about Bob, or somebody who wants to be Bob for a day, and we can talk about Bob's car. Now the question as that building block, the question about that building block is, how important is this for the internet? Is it important to see identity as one of the layers of the internet, or as a general purpose service type of thing? And that is sort of the thing that we want to get our finger behind in this panel. Is identity a basic part of the internet architecture? To have that discussion, we invited 4 panelists. And I was thinking whether I should introduce them with some of their attributes or not. I of course looked at LinkedIn to try and think of their attributes, because that is usually how we in a professional context introduce each other. But I'm not. I'm just going to refer to them with one attribute, and that's their name. And if they want to tell a little bit more about themselves, they may make those assertions themselves, and I'm not going to use LinkedIn for that. That's part of the thing that we're discussing today. Panelists are Jeff Hodges, Liv Johansson, Ken Klingenstein, and Natasha Roney. What we're going to do is we're going to have a few introductory slides in which the panelists will shape the sort of context of the discussion. And after that, we're going to have some discussion among the panelists, but we'll also open the floor for questions. During the introduction, I'd say let's refer from taking questions, otherwise we might go into all kinds of directions. Let's first do that introduction. I have 2 questions for the panelists. Please stand up when you do your intro, and everybody can see you. They can see other attributes than only your name and voice. And please refrain from using acronyms. The identity space is a huddle space. high acronym density language space. We want everybody in the audience also to identity management is not one of the daily factors of life involved in communication. So, without further ado, Jeff, would you mind, and Natasha can operate the, yeah. You can just stand there or here, it doesn't matter. Cool.
Hi. Okay, so I'm Jeff. Yes, it says I work at PayPal, but today I'm speaking just as an individual myself. Okay. And when we were talking about how to arrange all this, I can do a short straw in terms of painting an overall picture.
Will you test the microphone?
Excuse me? Is that all right. Sorry about that. So you couldn't hear what I just said. Okay, I'm speaking as an individual, and I drew the short straw on painting the overall picture, or taking a stab at it anyway. So, you know, what's identity? Well, everything has a notion of identity. As Olaf indicated, the collection of attributes that help define it. But G, in the context of what we're talking about the internet, what is it, how do we use it? Okay. And so this notion of identification, there's all sorts, identification, whatever you want to call, may refer to all sorts of stuff. And this is the first half of that Wikipedia page. And if you go to the next one, it starts getting a little more interesting in terms of what we're interested in terms, well, probably what we think about in the science and engineering area of various identification of things and maybe human individuals. But there's also this social science notion of it that more and more we're taking into account or is getting mapped on top of the internet and the systems we use. But this is just an indication that it's a broad topic and impinges on all sorts of different facets of the world and our existence. So next slide. So for myself, speaking as an individual, not necessarily speaking for the other panelists and such, what I see the context of our discussion is how do we, human subjects, interact with various other entities, human or not, throughout the internet and be known as us, or ourselves, for some definition of us that isn't necessarily under our control, and or have some control and assert ourselves as us. To me, that seems to be the big picture. I had these all left justified, but I guess that got hammered, unfortunately. And so on the next slide, but under the hood, which is what we here in the IETF typically muck around with, what does it mean? And well, it's mapping of, in the context of this particular discussion today, human subjects, but also things, probably, to, actions, events, processes, communication channels, physical devices, and all this kind of stuff. And we of course do it today in various ways, like whenever you log in on a website or your machine or your smartphone, but often it's disconnected. You're talking to what sometimes are called silos, and that don't necessarily talk to each other, and gee, maybe you don't want them to talk to each other. There's always that facet of things. More and more, we're getting a more and more seamless landscape but it's still somewhat fragmented. Okay, next one. But we also need to keep in mind there's these various tensions and tussles involved in the areas of naming, identification, agency, autonomy, privacy, and security, and such. So the more we work to make it smooth and seamless, we have to also take into account the individual's use cases and requirements and notions. Maybe they don't want to be identified with certain attributes, and they do want to assert other ones. How do we accommodate that? And also how do we make it seamless across different modes of interaction? Okay. So this is one way things are going, and one way or another we're headed this direction. This is shipping today. You assert yourself using a fingerprint, and it all gets mapped, and it just works. My personal understanding, or I think it's inevitable, these things are just going to know who we are, and what we need to define is in what ways do they know who we are, and who do they go tell? Where does the information go, and how is it regulated and such? So, and that leads to the next slide, which is, well, under the hood, how do we map this notion to the stack? Often we just do it up here at layer 7. It's where we think, but gee, in the UTA session just before this, we're talking about binding from the cryptographically binding communication channel from the application layer down through the transport, and communicating that binding at the app layer, but it's really looking straight down the stack and getting it all bound together. And so from the under the hood perspective is how do we map, how are we going to utilize this amorphous notion of identity appropriately at different layers? And of course that's context dependent. And so next one, but we also really need to keep in mind layer 9. And ACLU wants legislation on facial recognition privacy, for example. This is just the tip of the iceberg things. We need to realize that we shouldn't, not everything can get automated, not everything can be enforced at the technological layers. We need to keep in mind that layer 9 can be a useful tool, but of course it's, and that's legal, regulatory, legislative things. But it also can cut both ways, so like anything else, dual use technology. And you just gotta keep it in mind and try to use it effectively. And that's everything.
Thank you, Jeff. Natasha, please. Yeah, just stand here.
Oh, okay, cool.
I'll operate today.
All right, that means I have to remember what's on them. Cool. Hi, I'm Natasha Rooney. I'm the web technologist at the GSMA. I am a web person. I'm not usually an internet person. I do a lot of my work at W3C. My LinkedIn profile is definitely out of date. My Twitter stuff is much more up to date, so you can learn more about me there, Olaf. So probably just revealing too much. Anyway, okay, next slide. So as a web person and as somebody who works within the mobile operator space, I guess I'm here for two different reasons. Number one, to talk about use cases, and number two, to talk about identity providers and business. So next slide, let's go on first of all and talk about use cases. So this is a massive area, and I think we're going to hear that a lot. And I think that's going to be one of the things that we go away from this, is to understand that identity needs to be dealt with in a lot of different places, and already both Olaf and Jeff made reference to this. And I'm going to talk about use cases in a few different ways. I'm not going to say that this is a model that we should follow. I'm just trying to open up the different things that we're trying to look at. So first of all, with regards to identity, you've got the use cases around logging in and doing something. And that's different, and it needs different things depending on what you're trying to do. And I've done this in reverse order to what I was talking about when we were initially having this conversation for a particular reason. So, say for instance I want to go in and log in to manage money at my bank. As a user, I want to understand if I'm using my bank's online services, then my security is being protected to a very, very high level. In that case, I may not necessarily care if it takes me a long time to get it. I don't want to jump through too many hoops. I definitely don't like typing out all of those numbers, but I can understand that a long time might be necessary for me to gain that access to get into that service. The same might be said for health records. If I wanted to access my health records, this might be the same. If I want to buy something, maybe I want to log into Amazon. Strangely, that I want that to be secure because there's some payment processing that's going on there. But majority of the time, I also want that to be quick. Whilst with Twitter, I don't really care. I suppose it depends on what apps I've enabled Twitter to have access to. But generally speaking, if I'm staring at a whole load of Power Rangers walking down a street in Tokyo, which has happened to me recently, I kind of want to take their picture and tweet it pretty quickly. Cool, next slide. So when we talk about adding attributes, this is another set of use cases that you could probably talk about, although I've purposely left in health records there to show that there's some link. So say, for instance, I want to go ahead and buy alcohol online. Depending on how you feel about that, at least in this country, you need to be 21 to purchase alcohol. Is my understanding. In the UK, it's 18. I think in Japan, it's 20. So you might want to prove that you are that age so that you can go ahead and do that. So there's some attribute brokerage that can be done there, and some people are doing some work in this, and that raises some questions about who owns that attribute. Are you the people who own that attribute? Do you own your own attribute? Can you be trusted to relay your attribute, or are you constantly going to put the 1st of July 1970 as your age whenever you're going to go ahead and enter a site that contains something to do with alcohol? But the same could be true with health records. If I want to access my health records, maybe you could use some attributes to help you gain access into that, so that you're proving your identity perhaps with some of your attributes. And the same sort of thing as buying alcohol online would be the same as renting a car. Do you own a driver's license? Is it still in date, etc.? Cool, next slide, please. So, going back to my logging in and tweeting situation, I wanted to talk about identity being dependent on the situation. Twitter does not need to know that I am Natasha Rooney, however old I am, from which country I am, and my passport number, etc., etc. Twitter only needs to know that I'm the right person to have access to the account and to tweet from at this Natasha. It doesn't need to know anything else. There are a number of services on the internet that I really, really do not want to know, that I do not want them to know that I am exactly this particular individual. I like some sort of anonymity. That's the word I cannot say, by the way. I should have avoided it. I want some sort of anonymity, thank you, in certain situations. And I think we need to consider that when we talk about use cases for identity. Cool, all right, so let's go on. Let's move away from use cases for a little bit and move on to the business stuff. Thank you. So identity providers and business, which is the other section I guess I'll be adding today. So next one again. A few questions I think we might want to ask as part of this panel. Who manages the identity? There are a lot of identity providers available right now. Probably many people in the room are at least using one of the ones that I use for a number of services, one of the more popular ones. But do we trust these individuals with our identity? Do we want to continue using these companies? Is there another organization that we should be using? And how should this be done? There's a lot of talk going on right now about certain pieces of user information being transported in things like HTTP headers, and coming from my industry, I obviously know a lot about that. But is this the way that we want to go and do it? If we want to transport attributes over the net, how do we want to do that? How should they be secure? And how should we ensure that that happens? Now, as a web person, we can answer that a little bit in some of the organizations like W3C. But I think there's some work that can be done here in this audience to be able to ensure that we move forward. And then lastly, who needs to be involved in this? So we did talk about business stuff, we have talked about regulations come up as well. And maybe we do want to discuss the role of trusted entities and government in this. So lastly, just two massive questions from me. How do we solve for all the use cases? There's going to be some niggly use cases. I know it's going to be difficult to solve for everything, but I thought I'd stick it up there anyway. My byline there is solving the simplest first. At least with the group that I work in W3C, the WebMob group, we tend to try and take everything down to the lowest common thing and solve for that. And in this case, the lowest thing might be, with regards to identity, is just logging in. Like, can we just get login right? And if we did just go ahead and just get login right, would we then be able to then extend that? Would that be possible? So again, I don't know exactly how it works here, but we can talk about that. And then how do we enable secure trusted identity management, given what I was talking about earlier with reference to some ways of transporting? So cool, I'm done.
Hey, somebody flip me? Thank you. I guess I should start any presentation on I'll move so you don't have to. Any presentation on federated or identity in this audience probably needs to be prefixed by, I'm not here to sell you anything, I don't have a startup, I don't, you know. So I decided to talk a little bit about some observations that I've made as somebody who works my day job is operating an identity infrastructure, whatever that is. So I'm not here, I'm not a vendor, I'm not necessarily building technology, but I'm using technology for running identity. And talking to IETFers about this is an interesting experience, has been an interesting experience over the years, because one of the first reactions I get, so is it radius? So if it, no, not radius, maybe it's diameter, are you crazy? So the first thing you have to realize about identity, it's not about necessarily only about authentication and authorization. There are many more aspects to identity, which the previous speakers have explained. Next slide, please. The next observation that I've made, that I decided to put 4 things up here. The next thing is that the user-centric movement has been a huge distraction in our community and on the internet in general. That may be a controversial statement, but for hands up, who's heard of the concept of user-centric? Oh, that's good. I'm glad to see that I'm not missing that. Why I'm saying that user-centric has been a distraction is that all of the user-centric approaches or efforts that I've seen have all started out trying to avoid some sort of middleman or middle box or middle entity in identity transactions, and they've all, wound up in the hands of 1 or 2 major providers. OpenID, something that, I'm sorry for using acronyms again. One of the things that looked so nice in the identity space a few years ago, it's all in the hands of 1 or 2 major content providers. There's no user-centric left. And I think that we should realize that, I sort of understand why user-centric strikes a nerve with an IETF crowd. Because it sort of sounds like the end-to-end principle. And people like that. I like that. But the end-to-end principle is always assisted by infrastructure. And the infrastructure that I think is what I'm leading up to here, that we don't really have the infrastructure we need in order to do large-scale identity and trust on the internet. Next slide. Jeff said it needs to be repeated. There is no such thing as an internet layer. People have made claims like Facebook is the internet identity layer for the internet. That's not at all true. Jeff wants me to say that PayPal is the... never mind. But there's certainly no such thing as a layer for identity on the internet. It occurs on all layers. And it needs to occur on all layers. And the final thing, and where I need to land here, is next slide. So regardless of what Olaf says, this is sort of, we are at the IETF, right? We're having a briefing panel at the IETF. So it's appropriate to ask, look for gaps. What are the important gaps here? And the one major thing that I find myself wanting in my day job as an operator of identity infrastructure is that there is no such thing as a BGP for trust and key. And we desperately need it in order to build all of these mechanisms that are going to allow us to keep our users safe and private. We do need a scalable, an internet scalable mechanism for trust management. I'm not up here selling you on any concept. I don't know what it needs to look like, but I do know that we need to focus some effort and figure out a solution for this. Because otherwise, and the slide that I didn't put up here is one I'm going to give you just verbally, is the one quote that I often begin with when I'm talking about stuff like this, the one from Peter St. Andre, who said in this failed IRTF working group that we tried to start, that my motivation for being here, says Peter, is that the internet is such a low trust place. And it still is. And that is something we need to address. Right? That's my pitch for something. Ken?
So I'm going to cover 4 things fairly quickly. One is flashbacks between the TCP/IP layer and this internet identity activity. Second will be what are the active areas that people like Leif and Jeff and Natasha and I spend our day jobs at. Third one is the building blocks, and then fourth is key issues. So next slide. So comparisons to the TCP/IP layer. I think we're much more careful now about including trust in all of this stuff. I was there in the embarrassing early days when we thought, oh, nobody will send a fraudulent email, or no worries about DNS security or anything else. Well, naive. There's many more policy dimensions here than there was in the initial TCP/IP. We had running to daylight as our option. There's no cover now. I started in TCP/IP when I was teaching the OSI stack out of the Tannenbaum book. And we were all waiting for those information superhighway to come down, and so wonderful people like Van Jacobson and others could work under the covers without any scrutiny. That was really helpful. It's not like that now. In fact, it's not creative noodling on a deploying greenfield. I think that's what we felt like in the mid-'80s. We're more stitching and integrating disparate players with differing intentions. So it's not greenfield at all. It's taking some big beasts, and there's some big beasts represented on the panel, and making them work together and interoperate, and they don't all have the same intentions. And lastly, I was trained that if a protocol was good, it would fit on a cocktail napkin. And that was the original BGP standard, in fact, was that it had to fit on a cocktail napkin. This stuff is much bigger than a cocktail napkin. When we first did federated identity, we had a placemat, and even that wouldn't hold all of the boxes we were drawing on that. Next slide. So here are the active areas that we're spending our daytimes at. A lot about federated metadata. Metadata is the scaling mechanism at this level. It's very powerful. It has its own security needs, etc. But all of the scale we get is because of metadata. The metadata bundles that we pass around as federated operators have gotten so big and so volatile because of the information we're now including, that we have to move to dynamic metadata mechanisms. We're doing DNS, as it were, over Etsy hosts, and that's a very active area. We spend a lot of time on levels of assurance, our major acronym, and Justin is leading an effort on vectoring of trust, and we've had such good conversation that there's no more vectors in it. It's sets, I believe, of we spend a lot of time on attributes. Privacy and scale both flow from attributes, from replacing that access control list of names with attributes around that. And that also gives us not only scale, but it gives us privacy in the ACLs. So we need to know a lot about the metadata of attributes. Did you have the authority to assign that attribute? How was it bound to an individual? What are the terms of use on that attribute, et cetera? Lots of metadata issues. Reconciling regimes of privacy. This is an international environment that we're trying to deploy this in. The paradigms for privacy change dramatically country to country. Managing downstream use of attributes, again, a real concern to us. The terms of use that I mentioned earlier is an example of that. We all know how managing downstream use of anything is really hard. Look at the music industry. We're going to have the same sets of challenges here. And then making this all scale and the infrastructure to support it, we're spending a lot of time on that as well. Next topic. What do we build out of? We have our major acronyms, our identity providers and service providers. We have the attribute authorities who might be authoritative on attributes like citizenship, over legal age, member of a certain community, etc. We have lots of aggregators in all of this stuff, middlemen, portals, etc. And they make things very tricky. I don't want to release all of my, if a portal is hiding many applications, I don't want to dump all of my attributes needed by any of those applications into a single location. I'd like to refine the attribute release on a per application basis. Key management, always an issue. Trust management, always an issue. And now we have something new entering the space, consent management. Because in many, many use cases, consent needs to follow the attributes and the information, think medical records, think the complexity of environments that we now live in. Last slide. Key issues. Leveraging the emerging identity layer down the stack. As I look down the stack, it seems like almost every protocol down there could make use of this emerging identity infrastructure. It's no longer hierarchical in the classic PKI sense. It's much more complex and rich. And how do you begin to leverage that? What organizations act as a registry of registries, as we create all of our terms, a normalizer among registries? Can we have a single format that's consistent across the registries? What's being held in those registries? Information about attributes, information about endpoints, identity providers, etc. There's a tech transfer activity. This is very much a leading edge activity at this point. And we throw up a map often of countries that do not have these concepts yet. Somebody has to worry about that. And lastly, there are activities around the world trying to set the rules of the road for this. That's pretty difficult activity. And so as I think about the purity of IETF and ISOC, I would commend that we stay away from this one.
Are you as dazzled as I am? Let me first, are there clarifying questions at this moment? Do people have clarifying questions? Okay. So, in the title of this panel, I used identity as a building block. What I got away from all the speakers is that it's not singular. It is, in fact, an environment that consists out of many building blocks. And the components of a scalable, non-hierarchical, reusable, and scalable trust model, that's the term that Leaf used, Ken showed that that is not a blank sheet, but there is many building blocks that are currently being developed. Could you give me an indication, Ken, what the deployment status of these building blocks are? Because if I approach this as my usual self, then Where I see my identity used and where it is actually usable is in the social network sphere, where apparently I'm paying by sharing my attributes to be correlated, and secondly, I can use these social IDs to quickly log on to specific sites to share photos or get information about stuff. So, to me, what is visible as an ordinary internet user is just that one thing. And you talked about federations and interfederations and attribute exchanges and so on and so forth. Do they actually exist?
Good question, Olaf. The coverage varies dramatically by country. Almost all of this stuff began in research and education space around 2000 when some of us began to think about leveraging, the motto was authenticate locally, act globally, and that was our paradigm. So within the R&E space, the coverage is fairly complete in some countries, and less complete in others. And again, there is a trailing edge where there's almost no activity happening in the R&E spaces in those countries. In many cases, the activity has transferred from the R&E space to the general population. So if you look at countries like Sweden and Denmark, it's always the Scandinavians. There is very wide use now of federated identity in a commercial space, in citizen-to-government interactions, et cetera. So in the further north you move in Europe, the more this becomes ubiquitous across many different use cases. We are beginning now to develop activities, for example, within the US that takes the R&E space and provides access to government applications as well. So that's another citizen-to-government kind of interaction. It is very much the case, as you point out, Olaf, that the biggest use of federated identity is using your Google or Yahoo account to get to some kind of third party. And as you point out, when I do that, I have very minimal controls over what information gets released. It's an all or nothing mechanism, typically done with a very small font so that you don't notice what you're releasing. And so the biggest permeation, I think, outside of the R&E sectors at this point is within the social networking space. That said, the medical areas are moving very actively into this area. The density of relying parties out there, the way that medical records move from autonomous system to autonomous system in relying parties, especially here in the US, has brought this into the medical space and therefore the consent issues with your medical records as well.
Yeah, by all means.
Just briefly add to that. The one pattern that's fairly common is deregulation drives federation. So especially in identity, so for instance, telcos is one example, health sector, pharmacies, areas that have been subject to government regulation, that have been deregulated, privatized, where you typically see a very common pattern is you have, government, national jurisdictions need to retain some sort of regulatory control over, say, all pharmacies, and you have specific applications like drug prescriptions, especially narcotic drug prescriptions, where there's heavy regulation, but you still have private enterprise who needs to interact with the government sort of applications. And there's, what you see in a lot of countries, you see very, very quick deployment of these kinds of technologies. And for those applications, it's seldom an option to just go use your Facebook account to sign for Vicodin prescriptions. And higher assurance and higher security is combined with regulation is what typically drives deployment of the technology. But as you can sort of see in many societies these bubbles of interaction expanding outwards. Now they start to hit each other, especially at local government interfaces. So you typically train your nurses at a local government level, right? They need access to some of the same systems during their training. And you have teachers and et cetera, et cetera. It's all the expanding bubbles of these kinds of identity ecosystems that interact and interface at edges, which drives complexity.
Natasha, are you grabbing the microphone as if... Otherwise, fetch the other one.
I think I got it. So, cool. No, I wasn't actually going to talk about the government situation, but just draw on what Luke said about the identity providers and situations not using Facebook to log into to particular things. This goes back to what I was talking about earlier. It's strange, there's been a number of situations recently where I've been asked to choose an identity provider to log into things, and I tend to choose particular ones based on certain situations. You're right, I don't want Facebook to have anything to do with my health records. I just don't. Actually, I don't use Facebook for anything that's related to purchases. I'll probably use a different one. I have this sort of internal mindset that Facebook is to do with these social things that I'm logging into, and the other identity providers that I use for more secure things, and I think that's important to draw on. So yeah, I just wanted to make that point.
I see a queue building.
A queue lit.
A small queue, but Scott, please.
Scott Bradner. Could the panel address the U.S. government's trusted identities and cyberspace effort and see what they think of, say what they think of that, and whether it's relevant to the world?
Is that enough?
I suppose I should say something as one of the beneficiaries of that activity, as it were. It's been a difficult activity because it was framed as a public-private partnership, and some of the privates didn't show, and some of the publics that did show, we would rather that they hadn't. So it began fairly jumbled. Okay, for people who don't understand this, the NSTIC effort came out of the White House in 2009, right after Obama got elected. He did a 60-day cybersecurity review, and as a result of that, identified the transactional basis of activities within cyberspace as a critical area. NSTIC as a program has two parts to it. It has a governance part and a pilot part. I represent one of the pilots. There's about 10 pilots out there at this point. Most of the pilots are looking at clever commercial opportunities in this space. It might be attribute validation. There's been a couple of pilots in the attribute validation phase where a relying party receives some attributes and wants to know if they're valid or not, and goes to a third party and says, can you validate this postal address? Can you validate this information? And a marketplace of potential validators jockey around for a price point to do the validation. Does the price point reflect better validation? Not clear. So what you pay for in terms of strength of validation is uncertain. So there have been 2 or 3 pilots that have looked at infrastructure efforts. We're one of those pilots. We're looking at a consent manager among some other tools in that space. The governance effort is what I was describing before as the private-public partnership that's been difficult to date. I would say over the last few months it's found some traction by bringing in some trained professionals who can run processes not dissimilar to IETF processes and hopefully get closure in that process. So most recently, a set of privacy requirements have emerged from that activity that are very interesting and very specific, and talk about capabilities that various identity providers need to support, as well as relying parties. For example, the ability to create non-correlating identifiers for a user so that the user can browse the internet without correlation attacks. So the governance part has been challenging. I will point out that there's a finesse in the governance, two finesses in the governance piece. The first is, who does it apply to? Theoretically, the U.S. government can only regulate, as it were, interactions between citizens and government. But this effort in NSTIC land has been attempting to govern the broader cyberspace transactional piece. The second finesse is, does it apply globally or just to the US? And as we know from 863, documents prepared by the US government sometimes wind up with an inordinate traction around the world. Will the NSTIC effort have the same kind of global impact? Unclear.
Hi, Joe Hall. Another Joe, Joseph Bonneau, who I believe is now at Princeton, said something that made my brain fold, which doesn't happen as much as the older I get, which is authentication is increasingly a machine learning problem. I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that applies to identity? And if it does, what are the sort of risks and benefits of thinking of it as such? You know, you could imagine it making it easier to do things where you don't have specific things you have to keep control. I was looking at my keychain. I have so many weird little fobs. But also, to what extent does that make it harder for us to shed our identity or to not conceptualize easily the attributes we've been speaking about?
Allow me to direct that question to Jeff. Because I think that in the banking industry there is quite some automatic learning around attributes, but maybe I'm wrong.
Hi, no. So, not just speaking in general, there's this notion of risk-based authentication that many large entities do. Or perform. So, and this is various, and no one in particular, but the notion is that, okay, you have a user authenticate, but you kind of watch things, and I'm sure many of you guys who run nets may be doing similar things. You note where they're coming from on the internet.
I remember Danny McPherson in our previous panel expanding on that quite a bit,
right,
as a network security type of.
Yeah, you just be cognizant of what's going on, and if this user had an interaction with you, this asserted entity had an interaction with you an hour ago, and now the algorithm that figures out where they are shows that they're in Afghanistan. Well, gee, maybe you shouldn't put a lot of trust in that particular interaction at that point in time. And this, I believe, is the sort of notion that Bonneau's talking about here.
Oh yeah, Natasha.
I was just going to add to that. So it's interesting because credit card companies have been doing this for a while, right? So we have this, my cards get blocked when I go to another country I haven't been to before unless I phoned up my bank and told them that that's the case. But you could go on and extend it a little bit further. So you could say, based on location, that you say that this person is in this place, so maybe it's, or we think this person's in this place, so yeah, if they're in Afghanistan, maybe that's not them. You could almost do it for keystrokes as well. You could say somebody usually types on a key on a particular way. Somebody uses their phones at particular times of the day or uses a computer at particular times of the day. This user is logging in via Firefox. Why are they now using Chrome? There's a number of things that you could go ahead and use. It is scary. It definitely is scary because I guess that there is a lot of repercussions of things learning in this way. But then again, you could pull it back to those cases where perhaps it doesn't need quite such a high level of security. And that is objective, depending on which services you use that you don't think need that higher level of security. But you could, I think it is possible to allow that for those services which aren't so based on, health, money, and these kind of things.
So there's a Wikipedia page on risk-based authentication that someone has started. Needs a lot of work, looks like. They are pointing to a particular paper from 2006, which I have not read, but it's entitled Enhanced Authentication in Online Banking. That might be something to go, for those interested in this sort of thing, to go take a look at.
There is a question that lurks underneath here. We basically said, forget user-centric. It's not going to happen anymore. That's what we've said. That's the claim, so to speak. Now we have all these attributes flowing around, keystrokes, the fact that I'm in Afghanistan or another place and my credit card is, I cannot operate my credit card anymore. So these attributes start flowing around. What are the concerns with that? Can the panel speak to that?
Well, there are several, obviously. I mean, one of them is certainly, there is a natural reaction from anybody in the room, I think, about privacy here. But I think that it's worth to turn it around a little bit and realize that a lot of this, there's a feedback loop, has always been, well, there's been a feedback loop going on between social and identity, social services and social networking services and identity for a long time. And I think that feedback loop is getting hurt by the increased failure of knowledge-based authentication. Everybody knows where you are, right? You can modify your answers to a social. How difficult is it to hide your mother's maiden name from like from an attacker? It is getting very hard, and people who today rely on knowledge-based authentication are finding it increasingly hard to do that. I think that in turn is going to drive us towards what a lot of people in this community have been wanting for a long time, is get rid of passwords as an authentication mechanism, because it's the only way forward for us. It's to sort of not rely on the email nonce as an authentication basis for authentication. Now that in turn is going to cause problems for the very services that started all of this, right? If you built your business on not having a help desk, once you start enabling authentication mechanisms that, quite frankly, sometimes are a usability challenge, then you're going to get into trouble. So I think there's change coming in this space from the success of that feedback loop between social and identity. It's going to be really interesting to watch how companies like Facebook and Google actually manage to deploy things like two-factor authentication in practice and get away with it with their current business models.
I'm looking at my watch and I have a bit of a time shock. We have about 5 more minutes. Ted has been at the line for a little while. I wanted to cut the mic after Ted, but if this goes fast, then we'll see where we end up. Jim, please.
So, thank you. Jim Galvin. I want to thank the panelists and Olaf for the discussion. One of the problems that I always have in identity discussions is there's always this assumption, this implied presumption, implied perception, if you will, that there is a single root to the identities and we're building everything up underneath it and building towards that. Okay? So when you start talking about things like, gee, I can decide who you are by looking at who you're coming from, the browser that you're using, your location. I mean, I can collect up attributes and suddenly decide who you are. You're sort of moving in that direction. I mean, I like Jeff's presentation when he first started, right? Your first line was everything has an identity, and the question is, what is it really and what do we do with it? Ken made reference to a phrase that I'll borrow here, correlated identities. So sometimes there's a desire to merge things together and make them one thing. But I'd appreciate if the different panelists would speak specifically to the idea, I mean, why we should be very clear and very specific about whether or not there is a single identity or not. Sometimes that's appropriate, sometimes it's not. But why can't I just invent an identity for a context? And then I can just walk away from it when I don't want it anymore. And
right. And actually, that's if you look at my slides, it's one of the things I had in there in terms of having people would like to have a notion of being able to assert who they are, even though the parties you were communicating with might be trying to form their own assertion of who you are. And we do it all. We're doing it right now here in real life. That's what's going on. We're just trying to get to a place where it's more feasible to do it in the context of this network communication medium. And we're in fits and starts. I think we're kind of heading in that direction. The thing that I didn't put in there is there's another thing about identity, a statement by various people, but I'm blanking on the name. Anyway, identity is a story. So the risk-based authentication thing I was talking about, on your first interaction with some entity that's doing that sort of risk-based authentication, they don't have any context to go on. They don't have a story at that point in time. So it's kind of a shot in the dark from their perspective. But then they build up their story about you over time. And then there's lots of questions. And that's why I was waving around layer 9, legal, regulatory, legislation level. That layer figures into all of this. Jim's question was begging that.
Jim, we often talk about correlation as an attack, whereas linked identities is a very good thing in life, where I want to be able to connect some parts of my identity in one place with some parts of my identity in another place. And so linked identities is something that we think about, which leads us to a concept that we want to throw out here of identity portability. The ability to move my identity and all of my preferences for privacy management from one identity provider to another. If we're going to create a marketplace, we need identity portability.
And it's not there as a building block yet.
Not yet.
So I'm going to assert the identity whimsical coriander, and I'm going to rely on the room to assert the fact that it is appropriate for me to use he, him, and his as pronouns. And I'm going to suggest that you have the wrong question on your slide. Your original slide was...
You're a bit late with that.
Well, I think that you've just demonstrated that identity as a building block isn't the problem. There are lots of building blocks. The problem we have is with the grout. And that the way people are putting the building blocks together is uncontrolled from the point of view of the people about whom these attestations are made. And so maybe the work we actually need isn't in building new building blocks, sounds like we got plenty, but in figuring out how to dissolve the grout at the appropriate times that the user wants it gone. So that these identity building blocks and attestations can go away.
Ted, I'm a non-native speaker, and grout is a word that I don't understand.
I regret that.
It's the
stuff that sticks building blocks together. Okay. Between bricks, between...
Mortar. I think the analogy is breaking down.
Okay, I'm now going to attest that he knows more about the English language than I do. So mortar. So I think maybe what we actually are saying is, what's the technical work we need to make sure we can dissolve the mortar when it's time?
Mm-hmm. Is there... I think that's a good... I'm sorry, gentlemen, for I have to ask, because I think that leads to a good closing question. Talking about that grout, it's good to have that in my active vocabulary now. What type of grout do we need? Natasha said something. I want to solve the most simple problem. If Natasha and the others, if you were to get a bucket of grout at the local Home Depot, which bucket would you take? Would you take it for the yellow tiles or the green tiles? What is the thing you would stick together at this moment?
Natasha and the others, that's my band name. Yeah, which one was John's? Okay, I don't know the answer because, again, I'm not an internet person, but there's a number of things that have happened very recently about sort of insecure information traveling over particular layers of the internet, which certain people that I know and work with have been up to. And I would really like some guidelines or something to come out which is a secure way to transport that information. And it's the same question I asked previously. Identity providers want to go ahead and do that. And I know people are working on that. I know there are protocols and groups that are going ahead and doing that. But I think it would be great to go ahead and look at this and say, this is a secure way to transport this kind of identity information in the way that we think is a good route forward. It will evolve as things go forward, and that's what standards are here to do. But that would be my request.
Thank you. Ken, what would be your answer to that question?
Grout. Grout turns out to be very political in this space, and each country will have a different methodology for which building blocks are needed and how they're put together. And there's going to need to be triage among that because we live in an international world.
Is there a specific technical building block?
Well, we're starting that, and much as we use, I think the word federated identity needs to be replaced with interfederated identity, and that's a big challenge.
Leave.
So I'll get back to my BGP horse and beat it some more. We have a protocol that runs the network that is used to model business relationships, and that's what BGP is. We don't have that for trust.
Jeff.
So recent advances, not so recent, but we're building on it, but advances in technology, cryptographic technologies allowing us to facilitate individuals to bake into people's devices their capability to mint strong cryptographic keys on demand and wield them, hold the private keys close and wield public keys on a per interaction basis. And that's going to, it has the potential as something to build on to kind of change the picture. And I don't want to call it user-centric for the reasons that Lev, is worried about. But yeah, right. I don't want to make Lev mad at me. But that kind of has the potential to change the playing field somewhat. And I guess user-wielded or user-asserted, it can help enable those sorts of notions.
Thank you. That ends our session. I would like to ask you, when you walk out, please take the boxes. There are 2 dustbins here and there. We'll make and they're over there as well. Please take the boxes, leave the room as clean as possible so that the next session can go ahead. And thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you for your attention.